the world's foremost spokesman on general semantics, Dr. S.I. Hayakawa.
Paul, it's a real pleasure to be here, and to all of you and to all of Professor Hunsinger's colleagues, my greetings and my thanks for inviting me here. Let me start out by giving you quickly a timetable of what I'm going to lecture about each of these 5 evenings of this course. Tonight's lecture is Why General Semantics. Shall I put these on the board? Why General Semantics, the first one. Tuesday, what do you know and how do you know? This is a polite way of saying it's a lecture on epistemology, but that will scare people away. What do you know and how do you know? Wednesday, the self-concept and its role in communication. Thursday, semantics and social thought. And Friday, this is in preparation for a long weekend, semantics and sexuality. Those then are the lecture topics for the coming week. Perhaps the best way I can explain why I got interested in the field of semantics at all is to explain a little bit about myself and who I am and how I got that way. See, I got a PhD in English, in traditional linguistics and English literary scholarship, a perfectly innocent kind of English PhD. And I got this degree in the middle of the Depression. And I think of no education that more unfits you for the reality of life than a PhD in English. Anyway, with that degree, I went out into the world to lecture in the Extension Division of the University of Wisconsin. At that time, the Extension Division was just being begun at the University of Wisconsin. It was kind of the Siberia of Wisconsin. And it's where they put us young PhDs when they couldn't think of anywhere else to put us because they didn't quite want to see us starve. But it was during the years in the Extension Division that I really got my profound concern with the world and the language in the world. You must think back for a moment. In the late 1930s, what were the big events? Well, the greatest and biggest event was the rise of fascism and Nazism in Europe, more and more threatening the peace of the entire world. Here there was a New Deal in full progress, an enormous controversy going back and forth about it. But behind all this was one important fact of a communications revolution. I don't know how many of you have ever thought about this, but Hitler and Mussolini and Father Coughlin and Huey Long and Franklin Roosevelt and a large number of other political figures of this period attained their enormous influence by radio. And this is the first generation of politicians who got there by radio. There was nothing too much to be afraid of in most of our American political figures, but certainly the example of Adolf Hitler using language in this incantatory way to arouse these fiendish prejudices against all Jews and being responsible for their murder, their massacre, their exile, the destruction of their careers, their humiliation, and so on, while a large number of German people, supposedly the best schooled people in the world, seem to be falling for this, partly as a result of the revival that Hitler accomplished of deep, deep tribal animosities and tribal prejudices, deep old Germanic nonsense that he aroused out of the unconscious wells of national memory. The fact that he was able to do this so skillfully and lead Europe to the brink of war and to war itself, this fact struck me as the most startling and dangerous fact about radio. Now, Hitler himself commented on this very peculiarly. He said, David, sway a great, great crowd and play it like an organ practically and lead them his way. So that is leadership. And Hitler said, in effect, that's what I'm trying to do too. He was quite right about this. Is it not true that German intellectuals and intellectuals everywhere read his speeches in the papers and said, well, this is just a lot of rubbish, no one's going to believe that? But they did. And they did to a degree that just involved the whole of Europe and America and even Asia in this awful, awful Holocaust of the Second World War. And I'm now talking about just before the beginning of the Second World War, so far as I'm concerned. Here was I up in northern Wisconsin teaching extension classes in Wausau, Merrill, Rhinelander, Waupaca, Two Rivers, Manitowoc. Gosh, have you heard of these places? Antigo, and so on. And encountering something that really bothered me a lot. Namely, at the same time as I was worrying about Hitler falling for causing the German people to fall for incantation in Germany, I was observing the degree to which my own students in freshman English classes in the Extension Division were also victims of incantation. These are more innocent incantations. I refer to radio commercials. That is, commercials were a big thing then as they are now. This is in fact, the first great generation of radio commercials. But notice how very little product information a commercial contains. Nevertheless, notice how powerful and effective they are in moving goods off grocers' and druggists' shelves. I mean, the commercials are no better now. I mean, in those days, I remember commercials like 4 precious ingredients so valuable in the care of delicate hands, the doctors often prescribe them. You know, what are they? Soap, water, what else? You know, not too strong, not too mild, but just right. X-Lax. And you know, you have to ask the question, just like right for whom? You know, people who are 5 years old, people who are 20, people who are ill, people who just come back from the hospital, people who are 80 years old. Who is it just right for? But we react if we project ourselves. The meaning, just right for me? Okay, let's go get them. And serotan, if you spell it backwards, it spells natures. And you know, the whole business of selling by incantation still goes on. Just a year or two ago, I think it was the Ford Motor Company that kept drumming away at the great new Fords of that year. They kept saying, total performance, total performance, total performance. By gosh, you know, you're absolutely convinced that the windshield wipers work. But what otherwise extensionally does total performance mean? But this is the way in which, you know, we take language and give a kind of magical quality to Ford cars or Dial soap or Camel cigarettes or whatever by this kind of incantatory use of language. Well, I wasn't interested in fighting commercials as such. I was interested, however, in the intellectual processes that made such commercials possible, and they still make them possible. I was interested in the susceptibility to magical use of language and incantation that led ordinary people, including you and me, to believing things that are not so, into following paths of action that were contrary to our own interests, sometimes as consumers and sometimes as voters, simply because we are suckers for magical language. And I thought, what do you do as a teacher of freshman English? I don't know if you still do it or not, but I think I strongly suspect they do. You teach students to write places to put commas, semicolons, and quotation marks, and you tell them to straighten out their sentences and watch out for dangling modifiers and for paragraph structure. You teach them an awful lot of basically proofreading. I thought, why waste time on this nonsense when there's so many important things to teach in freshman English? Namely, what does language do to you as a consumer, as a citizen, as an individual? To what degree do you talk yourself into silly positions, nonsensical ideas, just because you're susceptible to any propaganda that flies around? And I listened to my students, they used to make me sick. That is, whatever cliches they heard from the latest radio commentator or from the radio commercial or editorials in the Chicago Tribune, they'll turn up in conversation and papers the next day, you see. And so often these cliches and so on were so completely empty of content. Let me tell you exactly what I mean by empty of content. In 1938 or 39, somewhere around in there, the Elks Club of Antigua, Wisconsin offered $50 as a prize for an essay contest on the Constitution of the United States of America. And so a number of students duly wrote essays on the Constitution of the United States. They paraphrased the same book in this one public library there. And when they gave me, as the local representative of the university, the papers to read to decide who was the prize winner, I couldn't make up my mind, because they all said the kind of same empty, abstract thing about what a great document the Constitution was and so on, straight out of the encyclopedia, except slightly paraphrased. And I didn't get angry at the students, but I did get angry at the educational system that said, in effect, that's how you answer the question, what is the meaning of the Constitution of the United States? Now, the reason this particular way of answering the question infuriated me is because I was, at that time, living in Antigua and, traveling around and circulating to other local communities, lecturing for the university. But I was observing certain things going around Antigua that deeply involved the Constitution of the United States. For example, over in Stevens Point, which is about 35 miles away, there's a furniture factory. Under the terms of the National Labor Relations Act, a union was trying to organize the furniture workers. This is part of the New Deal, you understand, you see. And the employers were pretty damn mad about it. And somehow the fighting became quite bitter between the union and the employers said that our constitutional rights are being violated by permitting this bunch of unionists to interfere with the relationship between us and our employees. And the union organizers said that their constitutional rights are being violated by all the ways in which the employers were trying to prevent them from organizing the union. So here are two views. The Constitution of the United States says the employers applies to protecting me from this union. And the union says it applies to protecting us from this employer. Who's right? But it's a constitutional issue, isn't it? In Lincoln County, Wisconsin itself, there was another constitutional issue. A group of Kentuckians got into trouble with the local district attorney. I don't know, they were migrant workers of some kind looking for a job. And so the district attorney started to take out after them, and the Kentuckians protested and said, "We are American citizens. Under the Constitution of the United States, you can't do this to us. We are American citizens." And the local district attorney said, "It doesn't apply. You may be citizens of the United States, but you're not citizens of Wisconsin because you haven't established residence yet, so we can do this to you." And so the Kentuckians brought up a live constitutional issue right there in Antigo, whether or not the Constitution applied to protect these Kentuckians from harassment by this district attorney. Gee, the third issue was the most interesting one of all. You know the religious group known as Jehovah's Witnesses. I don't know if they still do this, but at that time they had a technique of missionary work that involved knocking on your door and asking if you had a phonograph. And if you said yes, they would say, "We will play a record for you." So they'd come in your house with a record which contained the missionary messages of Jehovah's Witnesses. It's all very fine, except, as you may know, Jehovah's Witnesses are extremely anti-Roman Catholic. And so some very anti-Roman Catholics were included in this recording. Well, some of Jehovah's Witnesses and their missionaries got beaten up by a group of Catholic youths who broke their record, you see, and beat up on it. And the Jehovah's Witnesses are an extraordinarily litigious bunch, as you may know, and so they immediately went to court and demanded an injunction under the Constitution of the United States, freedom of speech, religious freedom, etc., etc., and the right to propagate their religious doctrine without being interfered with by a bunch of thugs who want to beat them up and bust their records. Well, the local police chief, who himself was Catholic, said in effect, boys will be boys, and refused to prosecute. But there again, there's a local controversy, sharply dividing people. Does the Constitution protect Jehovah's Witnesses in these circumstances? The police chief said the Constitution said nothing about phonograph records. Well, now, as I said, there are at least these three live constitutional issues going on right in Antigo, Wausau, and Stevens Point. That's a triangle, 30 miles each side or so. And not one student who was writing an essay on the Constitution of the United States saw fit to mention any one of these to say that the Kentuckians were right or wrong, that Jehovah's Witnesses were right or wrong, that the union or the employer was right or wrong. And this bothered me very, very much. See, how can you study the Constitution of the United States without ultimately finding, as you go down the abstraction ladder, that applies to the way you may behave, and you may behave, and you may behave as newspaper editor, as you may behave as chief of police, as you may behave as a patrolman, as you may behave as a teacher. Ultimately, the Constitution doesn't mean anything if it doesn't apply extensionally, does it not, to how you and I live and what rights we may have. But notice that the high school exercise simply said, write an essay on the Constitution. And obviously the students were directed not to look at the realities for which the Constitution ultimately governed, but they're asked to look at what? A reference book. Of course we must have reference books, but is that the sole source of information? Is not the Constitution a living document right to this day? And so, let me explain this in a sort of simple-minded way. Here's the Constitution of the United States, a whole body of words. One way to examine the Constitution is to go to a library and find more words about these words. And if you're not satisfied with that, you can go to further libraries and get further reference books so that you get words about words about words about words about words about these words. And that's the way a lot of academic life is organized, you've got to admit. Then the other way of examining this is to study the words and study the commentaries and some other words about it, but also study the historical events, the realities, the decisions, the things people have done as a result of them, and the social institutions they have set up, and the habits they've developed in community after community as a result of these words. When you do that, then you are studying this language in action, in the thought and behavior of actual living people. Now I kept thinking, if you studied language in this way, relating language ultimately to some kind of social or physical reality, then you wouldn't get lost talking hot air and nonsense. And so I got this great zeal to teach my students in freshman English something besides grammar, spelling, and punctuation. I thought I'd like to teach them semantics. But you know, there was no textbook in semantics available at the time. There were only difficult technical books in philosophy and in scientific method and so on. And I was floundering about, wondering what to do about this, and recalling some of the reading I had done in graduate school in I.A. Richards and C.K. Ogden and C.W. Bridgman and so on. And I had heard about Korzybski, but I hadn't read him yet. Then Stuart Chase wrote a book called The Tyranny of Words. That was a very important event. It came out in late 1938, I believe. And that book has been much criticized by specialized scholars, but I want to say this a lot in its defense. And that is, Stuart Chase, having read this highly technical literature of semantics, reinterpreted it in his own inimitable popular style and said, look, it applies to you and you and you and you, and to all of us. It applies especially to himself, he said, how to straighten out our woolly thinking, our capacity for unmitigated windbaggery and hot air. It's a discipline that we must all subject ourselves to ask ourselves such questions as, what are you talking about, if anything? That's a very embarrassing question, you know. Well, anyway, I must say that Stuart Chase and the success of his book gave me an awful lot of morale. And I thought, if Stuart Chase can explain this to the general reader, I can explain it to my freshmen. And so from then on, for the next 2 or 3 years, I kept rewriting Language in Action over and over again for I must have written that book about 5 or 6 times before it got first published in regular book form, when it became, as Paul Hunsinger just told you, fortunately for me, a Book of the Month Club selection. But by that time it was too late. See, it was too late in one very important sense. It was a selection for December 1941. And the war I was hoping to prevent, by having people understand semantic principles so they wouldn't fall for all this war propaganda, well, it started right then and there. For, of course, it already started in Europe. But I'm very happy to say that, with the publication of Irving Lee's book, Language, Habits, and Human Affairs that same year, and a very few years later the publication of Wendell Johnson's People in Quandaries, and the influence of people like Elwood Murray here and others in other places teaching general semantics wherever they were, in their speech courses, their psychology courses, their philosophy courses, their English courses, and so on, the thing gradually developed momentum so that we still have a general semantics movement going today in education and becoming, I think, more and more influential. Let me go a little bit into the backgrounds of this discipline. One way of explaining our interest in language is to say something like this. Supposing you had intelligent fish who developed a science. What science would they first develop? Well, obviously they develop a science of other fish, particularly the ones they were most afraid of. Would they not? And then they might develop a science of botany of seaweeds, because some of them are edible and some of them are not, and some of them are dangerous, and some of them make secure hiding places, and they might develop a botany of seaweeds. They might, for example, do some work in the oceanography of the ocean floor, how the ocean is structured and where the pressure is too great for certain kinds of fish and where it's very nice for other kinds of fish. They might begin to study that. But perhaps the last science that the fish would ever get around to would be the science dealing with the fact of water. Because they're so completely immersed in it that it doesn't occur to them to think about that as a factor in their existence. So in a similar way, human beings have made studies of mountains, of plants, of animals, of birds, of rocks, of metals, of stars, of the moon, the atmosphere. But the one thing they have not studied deeply, deeply, and made it a regular part of elementary education, is the fact that we live in an entire environment created and conditioned by language. I mean, how can you sit there and say, for example, I'm a Jew and he's a Gentile, I'm a Catholic and he's a Protestant, I'm white and he's Negro, unless you've got linguistic systems? How can you say, for example, I'm in Colorado and not in Utah? What's that mean? It means that you're under the jurisdiction of one state government, not another state government. What's a state government? A whole body of rules, regulations, and limits placed to communications and its authority, are they not? I mean, take your dog across the border into Mexico and try to explain to him what happened. But notice the human beings, the fact that I am no longer in the United States but now in Mexico, is a great big huge, quote, fact, unquote. There's no fact to a horse or a dog. And where does that fact come from? It comes from a linguistically created agreement by means of which our government and the Mexican government drew a line somewhere or another and said, over there is Mexico and over here is the United States. Okay? Yes, sir, okay, let's shake. No? There isn't a river there necessarily. There isn't a mountain range there. Land doesn't drop off a few hundred feet to mark the difference. It's just an imaginary line. But still, it is an important, what? Social reality. And we live in a world of social realities created by language. Created by language. Here's a man and woman living together, and here's another man and woman not living together. These two have said words before us. Justice of the peace or a preacher, this couple has never said those words. These people are respectable people. These people are living in sin. Okay? But what they do, same thing. Yeah? But they have not entered into the linguistically created agreements that recognizes this as a family unit and this as not a family unit at all. Who that? So I wonder if I'm beginning to make clear what I mean when I say that we live in a world created by language. We're immersed in it as a fish is immersed in water. If you want to think about it deeply sometime, sit in your own living room, and if you wish, have your very intelligent dog sitting beside you, and look around the room, see what there is that's meaningful to you but not to the dog. There's the collection of Shakespeare. There's Batman comic books. There's Beethoven or the Beatles on your record player. There's an American flag. There's a souvenir of 1933 Chicago World's Fair on your piano. There's a diploma saying you got your PhD or a golf championship or whatever it is you got. All sorts of symbols around. There are pieces of crockery around. This little vase you paid an awful high price for because someone assured you it was genuine Meissen ware. And so you value that very much. You wouldn't dream of, filling it with soup or anything like that. It's Meissen. And how do you know it's Meissen? Well, somebody told you so. It's a linguistic continuum somewhere that gives you the authority, and so you handle it with greatest care. You sit in that room and look around you and think of all the things that are meaningful there. That have no meaning whatsoever to that dog that's sitting beside you, even a very intelligent dog. And what are those meanings? Are they not symbolic meanings? That pictures or vases or rugs or wallpaper all symbolize something or other, music and so on. And this symbolism is partly a nonverbal symbolism, but partly a nonverbal symbolism that is defined by verbal symbolism, like this Meissen vase. And so, as you look around, all the nice things that you have in your living room, all the things you treasure, this is my home. This is me. These are things I treasure. Here's a photograph of my grandmother. And so on and so on. You cherish this symbolically created environment which you created for yourself. The dog doesn't care whether the rug that he's lying on, came from Turkey or China or New Jersey. It's just a rug. You care very, very much. Then you turn on the television set or the radio, and you hear all kinds of things that are part of your environment. You hear that Tenneco has gone up 10 points and IBM has gone up 20. That's good. Okay? Or you hear the Sinclair oil has gone down 15 and you think it's disastrous, and so on. Or you hear news from Czechoslovakia, from Paris, Moscow, Saigon, Istanbul, Auckland, and all these things bother you or excite you, or make you more or less unhappy. The dog's there listening to the radio too, but it doesn't mean a darn thing to him. So I hope I make clear what I mean when I say that a dog inhabits a physical environment only. We inhabit a semantic environment created by the knowledge, ideas, doctrines, beliefs, etc., that just simply surround us as water surrounds a fish and completely conditions his life. And then with these words that bombard us from the semantic environment, then we think. Because almost all thinking is talking to oneself, is it not? The behaviorist said all thought is talking to oneself. I'm not going to go quite that far. But you don't have to go quite that far to concede the tremendous importance of the fact that we talk to ourselves about everything we see, and how we talk to ourselves conditions what we see and the way we see it. And if our spoken evaluations are hasty and ill-considered, it's likely that our unspoken ones are even more so. Or a man may say, I don't like fish, although there are thousands of different kinds of fish and dozens of different ways of preparing each kind. But he still doesn't like fish. So he avoids also squids, clams, and lobsters, which are not fish any more than bats or partridges. Now this may seem a trivial example, but don't all prejudices work in just this way? Racial, ideological, religious, occupational, national, regional, etc. Like the man who doesn't like fish, there are the ideologically muscle-bound who disapprove of the profit system without caring to specify whether he means the corner newsstands or General Motors, or who reject all government interference in business, regardless of what branch of government is interfering in what business for what purposes. And all sorts of unexamined key words in our thought processes, whether fish or free enterprise or government interference in business or the military mind or bureaucracy or creeping socialism, all kinds of words with which we beat each other on the head, and organized political movements, organized prejudices and so on, all creating an illusion of meaning where no clear-cut meaning exists. And these words hinder and often misdirect our thought. As C.S. Peirce has said, it is terrible to see how a single unclear idea, a single formula without meaning, lurking in a young man's head, will sometimes act like an obstruction of inert matter in an artery, hindering the nutrition of the brain and condemning its victim to pine away in the fullness of his intellectual vigor and in the midst of intellectual plenty. Now, except for the fact that we sometimes act without thinking, it would seem obvious that how we act is determined by how we think. But notice that even when we, quote, act without thinking, unquote, our actions are likely to follow the lines laid down by patterns of thought previously established, which in turn are determined by the language we People so often talk about language as if it were something out there, something in a book. But language, to be language, has got to be inside oneself. Language has to have meaning, and meaning resides inside oneself, nowhere else. That is, for example, if I were to tell you an obscene story in Hindustani, and you didn't understand Hindustani, it wouldn't be an obscene story, it wouldn't even be a story. Why? Because the obscenity is not in the language itself so much as in the fact that knowing the language evokes all the images that these words are supposed to evoke. But if the words of the Hindustani story don't evoke anything, then it isn't anything. And meaning is inside the human nervous system. It's not in a dictionary, even the ones I write. They're pretty good, but, there's a limit. Meanings are inside the human nervous system. And the language is therefore not just sounds and spellings, but more importantly, the whole repertory of semantic reactions which the sounds and spellings produce in those who speak and understand the language. Now, let me go back for a moment to my struggles as a young instructor in English at the University of Wisconsin Extension. And while I was floundering about, having read Stuart Chase and so on, I went to the University of Michigan one summer because they advertised a course called Semantics, and I thought, well, this is what I've been interested in for such a long time, I've really got to get to this course. And when I got there, I discovered that the course was not in what I would call semantics at all, but it was a course in lexicography. And all us as graduate students were being sort of roped in to work on a dictionary of early modern English. And that's all right, I don't mind that. But still, I didn't like the fact that they called it semantics. So I complained to the professor about it, and so did a couple of other students, and he said to all of us, he said to one of them, have you read Ogden and Richards? And the young fellow said, yes. And so why don't you lecture on it? He said, who's read Korzybski? And I said, I've read a little bit of it. Why don't you lecture on Korzybski? And so we all got assigned lectures on semantics in this course, because he said, I haven't read any of that stuff. So I gave a lecture on Korzybski in the summer school of the University of Michigan, in Ann Arbor, in the late 1930s. And, having lectured on him, I got even more curious, because I didn't know if I had understood him properly or not. So I wrote a letter to Korzybski, and he wrote me back from Chicago to say, please come and attend a seminar. So, after summer session was over, I went to Chicago, and knocked on his door, and met by his secretary, and was introduced to Korzybski, with whom I'd exchanged a few letters earlier, And he's a strongly built man, completely bald. I think he ran an electric razor over his head quite regularly, but there wasn't an awful lot of hair there anyway, and thick glasses. And he apparently been injured, wounded in the First World War, so he had one leg that was crippled, and so he would stomp around in it with a great big walking stick, and he had a thick Polish accent. And so when I came into his office the first time, he said, so you are Hayakawa? I said, yes, sir. You are the man who lectured on general semantics at the University of Michigan, and you don't know a goddamn thing about it. I said, yes, sir. And so we became very good friends right away. That I could pull all these semantic ideas from should I say, from literary criticism, from linguistics, from Alton and Richards, from Poincaré, and so on. All this could be brought together, I think, only because the overall framework provided by Korzybski's ideas proved to be so. And so I studied with him and took successive seminars with him, and much of, the fact that I could pull all these semantic ideas from, should I say, from literary criticism, from linguistics, from Alton and Richards, from Poincaré, and so on, all this could be brought together, I think, only because the overall framework provided by Korzybski's ideas proved to be so suggestive and useful. But to go back to this matter of the meaning of language being in semantic reactions inside the human nervous system, let me read you what he says on the subject. A language, any language, has at its bottom certain metaphysics which ascribe consciously or unconsciously some sort of structures to the world. Now these structural assumptions are inside our skin when we accept a language, any language. We do not realize what tremendous power the structure of a habitual language has. It is not an exaggeration to say that it enslaves us through the mechanism of semantic reactions, and that the structure which a language exhibits and impresses on us unconsciously is automatically projected on the world around us. In other words, to a large extent, we see as we do, partly because we talk as we do. This is a very trivial little experiment, but it illustrates something very nicely. I've drawn two meaningless lines on the board, but notice, just look at them very carefully, but notice how different they look when I say telephone poles. One recedes in the background. It's strange. How we talk about something, in a way, helps to determine how we see it. Well, that's only one example. We can go on, but let me tell you more about Korzybski. Korzybski was trained as an engineer and a mathematician. He also studied mental illnesses in association with the famous Dr. William Melanson White at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C. His general semantics is, in a curious way, the product of both his scientific, that is in the sense of physical science, his scientific studies and his psychiatric studies. And the theme of his most famous book, Science and Sanity, an introduction to non-Aristotelian systems in general semantics, is that the orientation of science and are the orientations that result in sanity. That the orientations of science, as opposed to what he called pre-scientific orientations, have at their heart an awareness of the linguistic components of human thought and awareness, and thought and perception. In the same sense that a scientist is always conscious of the words he uses and how those words, in a way, affect what it is that he sees and what he does. If we could only apply that kind of consciousness of our linguistic mechanism to our everyday thinking outside of what is now known as scientific subject matter, we could become more and more sane with each success in applying this principle. Korzybski believed that if through general semantics people generally could be trained in the orientations of science and the handling of problems, many problems now deemed insoluble would prove soluble after all. Now, this is a kind of optimistic idea, but where we don't use scientific method, what kind of methods do we use? Think of the number of problems that are solved by good-hearted and zealous people who think entirely in terms of slogans. And certain kinds of slogans get them, move them deeply, and they go to work and organize committees and pressure Congress and do all kinds of things. And often there isn't a scientific idea behind it, and often there's not much success in the project. How do we go about solving problems? Much of the time, we don't solve them, we act according to our wish fulfillment fantasies. Sometimes we don't solve problems, we just enforce, if we have the power, our own decisions upon other people, whether they like it or not. And if Korzybski said that many, many problems now deemed insoluble could maybe be made soluble through the application of general semantics to areas where it is not applied, if this all made him sound a little messianic, it aroused the enthusiasm of some people and it aroused the deep suspicion of others. It aroused Elwood Murray's enthusiasm and mine, but we were nuts anyway. Weren't we, Elwood? Then our more cautious academic critics ganged up on us very frequently, and so we've been living with this for a long time, so we're getting accustomed to it. But anyway, I say all this to you to say that the subject is still, in the minds of many, still controversial. Why? Well, I came across one aspect of it just recently. People in linguistic science in the United States are very, very proud of the application of scientific method to the analysis of language. But by analysis of language, they mean studying, for example, the sounds of language, phonetics. And I agree with the phoneticians that the development of the phoneme theory in our time is one of the triumphs of linguistic science. So I have no argument. There are other things that have been developed in linguistic science, but all of them have to do with minutiae of language structure, of differences of dialect, of tiny differences of vocabulary, the scientific analysis of what is a sentence, stuff like this. Not one of these studies will help you to evaluate thoughtfully whether you prefer George Wallace over Richard Nixon. Not one of them will help you evaluate whether to believe the editorial in the Denver Post or the Wall Street Journal. Not one of them gets to the heart of the linguistic problem. Is this individual talking nonsense or isn't he? Is he telling the truth or isn't he? Is he kidding himself or isn't he? Do these words represent an accurate map of the territory of human experience, which they purport to talk about? Does this language satisfy emotional needs? Does it exacerbate existing misunderstandings? These are important questions about language. After all, language comes to life only when I say something to you and you say something back at me, and as a result of this we become better friends or we become worse enemies. Interaction continues to go on all the time. And that's the most exciting thing there is about language. No. Not whether you pronounce the middle T in butter. Some people say butter. So that's a big deal, isn't it? So people spend a lifetime studying these minutiae of differences. But I am interested in what happens between, let us say, a psychotherapist and a patient that results in the load being lifted off the patient's mind. What did the psychotherapist say and do that made it possible for the patient to say things that he never managed to say to anybody else before? What kind of interaction is that? I'm interested in the techniques of a federal mediator. Here's a union and an employer just locked in battle. They can't do a damn thing without infuriating each other. And here's a mediator that knows somehow how to get them to communicate. That's language in action. That's using language for the purposes it was invented for, namely to organize human cooperation. And so the language of the psychiatrist, the language of the diplomat, the language of the wise parent, the language of the good teacher, the language of the federal mediator, all these kinds of language that result in the increase of understanding, the increase of human communication, and the decrease of superstition, error, prejudice, and so on. These are things I'm interested in. Linguistics people are not interested in this, or at least they say, we would like to be, except it's not scientific yet. But it's not going to be scientific ever unless unless someone's going to go in and tackle it. Now, let me summarize some of the ideas in general semantics which, according to traditional linguistic scholarship, are quite unscientific, but which you will recognize immediately as being of extraordinary practical value in evaluating not only the way other people talk to you, but how you talk to yourself and how you talk to other people. The most important thing we can do with language is to make sense, is it not? And how do you do that? Korzybski summarized in a few simple and highly original formulations what he felt to be the basic assumptions underlying the habits of evaluation common to the most advanced contemporary thinkers. These modern habits of evaluation appear to rest, he said, upon three fundamental non-Aristotelian premises, he called them. Non-Aristotelian, not anti-Aristotelian. Namely, comparing the relationship of a language to reality with the relationship of maps to territories, he said, as you all are familiar, the map is not the territory, the map is not all the territory, a map is self-reflexive, in the sense that an ideal map would have to include a map of the map, which in turn would have to include a map of the map of the map, etc. Now, evaluative habits based upon these premises, Korzybski said, result in flexibility of mind, lack of dogmatism, emotional balance and maturity, such as characterize the best scientific minds, at least in their thought within their special fields. But as you know, almost everywhere, evaluative rigidity prevails. People are addicted, on all topics in which scientific orientations are not yet general, to rigid adherence to systems of dogmas, eternal verities, slogans, and catchwords. Pigs are pigs. And socialized medicine is socialized medicine, no matter what you call it. And acts of aggression should be called by the right name. And everything is either A or not A. You're either for us or against us. There is no middle ground. Nothing is both A and not A. You cannot be both a communist and a non-communist. In order to facilitate the transition from Aristotelian to non-Aristotelian orientations, Korzybski offered a set of rules by means of which individuals could evaluate their own evaluative processes. Let me run over them quickly for you, some of them. Since this is the first lecture, let's get the fundamentals out of the way. Indexing, words lump together unique individuals under a common name. Names give a mistaken impression of identity to non-identical objects and events. And this impression, when translated into behavior, results in identical reactions to all individuals of the same name. For example, some persons have fixed reactions to Republicans or unions or subsidies or Negroes or whatever. Hence the practice of adding index numbers to all our terms. Republican 1, Republican 2, subsidy 1, subsidy 2, and so on. Dates. That's number 2, dates. Heraclitus says you cannot step in the same water twice. The world and everything in it is in the process of change. Maps of yesterday are used as guides to the territories of today. And therefore, all maps should be dated. Supreme Court 1967, Supreme Court 1968, Supreme Court 1969. John Smith Monday, John Smith Tuesday. So on. This principle of dating is very impressive. If you ever go to the inside offices of the American Automobile Association and you ask for to the state, but they're changed from hour to hour, day to day, as telephone reports come in as to where a detour has been put in and where another detour has been eliminated, and so on and so on. But the map you get at the service station is pretty static. But we don't have that kind of fluidity. And there are people who say, well, I went to the University of Denver in 1944, and I know exactly what that damn place is like. And so on and so on. See, I visited Chicago in 1951, I don't care for it. Los Angeles always was a nothing town. So on. And you hear this kind of statement about dynamic, flexible, moving things, attitudes that remain fixed over time, and so ideas have to be dated. Number 3, etc. All statements should be accompanied by an implicit or explicit etc. to remind one of the premise that maps do not represent all the territory. That no statement about objects or events in the real world can ever be final. 4, the is of identity. The common injunction to call a spade has the profoundly misleading implication that we call it a spade because that's what it is. Or the other way of saying it is that pigs are rightly called pigs because they're such dirty animals. Quotation marks. Many terms in everyday language have pre-scientific metaphysical or structural implications. Therefore, ordinary vocabulary being full of these terms, we ought to remember to put quotation marks around all sorts of dangerous terms like mind, race, substance, objective, subjective. The word same should always put quotation marks around it, and so on. Now, these are just a few of the ideas, the elementary mechanisms of general semantics. But the unique feature of general semantics was that it offered for what its originator believed to be the first time in history a positive functional theory of sanity. The rules of evaluation purported to describe not just how best scientific minds do work, but how all human minds ought to work. And here Korzybski made use of his study of the mentally ill, as well as his studies of political controversy and philosophical disputation. In these areas he found lack of indexing, that is prejudice, lack of dating, that is inflexibility, the is of identity, reliance upon word magic and incantation, and other violations of his rules to be extremely common. And to thinkers on social, political, and ethical problems, therefore, he urged a systematic application of his rules as a way of enabling them to escape the limitations placed upon them by the outmoded evaluative habits and inadequate traditional language structures. Now, in the subsequent lectures in this series, I shall try to elaborate on some of the implications of the ideas of general semantics, particularly as they have been added to and enriched by subsequent authors who have thrown light upon the communicative process in one way or another. Let me wind up this evening's presentation by simply quoting a poem written by a general semanticist, Claude Coleman, at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, Illinois. The poem goes like this. All problems are not merely verbal, philosophers have told me in countless thousands of words. But I tried to make love with my mouth taped shut, and I lost my love. I tried making friends with my mouth taped shut, and I lost my friends. I tried making war with my mouth taped shut, and no one was angry, and the shooting stopped. So I walked about the streets with the mouth taped shut till they sent me to a mental hospital, where I am to this day, wondering if all problems are not merely verbal. Thank you. What I would like to follow as a format for these evenings, then, is to spend the remaining time until 9 o'clock discussing your questions as you care to bring them up from the floor. Sir.
Dr. Hayakawa, what would you say is the place of poetry in semantics, if any? And in that semantics deals primarily with meanings, how would we perhaps reconcile this with Archibald MacLeish's theory that a poem must not mean but be?
You know, I gave you a list of subjects that I'm going to lecture on the rest of the week, but those are subject to change anytime anyone wants to change them. I have been working myself very much on a theory of poetry lately, and that is that a poem, in a sense, never asserts anything so much as it, I use a metaphor here, it's not a very good one, so much as it performs a dance that creates the state of mind that the poet wants to put across. I don't know, let me see. I'm going to take about 5 minutes to really go into this, because I haven't scheduled this for the rest of the week anyway, in the lecture titles I've given you. But you can divide an utterance, almost any utterance, into two parts. One you can call message and the other you can call meta-message. Like this. Two gentlemen have met each other. As they take their leave, they say, one of them says, let's get together for lunch one of these days, and the other one says, yes, let's do that, and they shake hands and go away. And sometimes lunch results and sometimes it doesn't. When it doesn't, it's because either or both parties knew profoundly that the other was saying, goodbye, I don't care if I ever see you again. See? Now how do you know? Well, you know it in the tone of voice, you know it in the friendliness of the smile, you know it by a large number of non-lexical accompaniments to the lexical message which said, let's get together for lunch. So let's call the invitation lunch the message. Let's call the non-lexical components of that message the meta-message. The meta-message then may cancel the message. It may say, let's get together for lunch, I don't really mean it, you see. Or it may reinforce the message. It can say, let's get together for lunch, I really mean it, you see. Now, I have begun to think that the analysis of meta-message is one of the most important things that one of the neglected fields of linguistic study. When you say that this man's prose is deadly dull and this man's prose is wonderful to read and keeps you awake, and let's say they're saying the same thing pretty much, and explain the same kind of message, what's the difference? I think that a skillful writer is one who gets meta-message into his prose. That is, when he says, let's go to lunch, it really sounds as if he wants to go to lunch, you see. And if he says, I denounce the following actions of the Democratic Party, he really sounds angry and denunciatory, whereas a dull writer will just criticize the Democratic Party and you get halfway through it and you go to sleep, you see. Now the difference is that the prose itself carries meta-message when the prose comes to life. That is, it sounds like a man talking. It carries the intonations, the rhythms of his anger or scorn or concern or love, if you've got good prose writing. Now, you take that one step farther, supposing you go so far that you don't give the message at all and say it all in meta-message. When to the sessions of sweet silent thought I summon up remembrance of things past, and sigh the lack of many a thing I sought, and with old woes new wail my dear time's waste. Then can I shed a tear unused to flow for precious friends hid in death's dateless night, and weep afresh the long since cancelled woe of many a vanished scene and vanished sight, and so on. You know, this. What's Shakespeare saying? He's saying in that long sonnet, you know, he's saying, when I feel very sad, I think about you and it cheers me up. That's basically all he says. But if the while I think on thee, dear friend, all losses are restored and sorrows end. Now, a poem then is saying something almost entirely by meta-message and not saying it as a message at all. In that particular sonnet, he comes very close to giving a message when he says, but if the while I think on thee, dear friend, all losses are restored and sorrows end. But all the rest of it is sort of dancing is concerned, is it not? I use that metaphor, dance, because I haven't thought of a better one yet. But perhaps poetry is saying things almost entirely in meta-message, never mind what the message is. And to come back to the point this lady brought up, sometimes there are different messages depending on the reader, because each of us has different emotional needs, and some of us find different emotional needs met in a particular poem with its particular meta-message. This is why I don't want to go too far in deciding what a poem says either, you know. I hope I'm answering your question. Yes, sir.
Washington
McLuhan have any connection in study semantics? Is he affected in any way?
The question is about Marshall McLuhan. Marshall McLuhan and I, by the way, come from the same hometown of Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. I said earlier that my basic stimulus at the time I started writing on semantics was radio and the impact of radio on the politics of the world. Despite the fact that we are very close to being the same age, he comes along practically a generation later because the big impact on him is television. See? I don't know what he was doing while radio was going on, but I guess he wasn't listening. But anyway, I regard his work as of extreme, extreme importance. Because see, whenever a new medium of communication is invented, no one knows what the consequences will be. When you think about, well, there was an article in Time magazine on the transistor radio not too long ago and what it means to the world. Little villagers in remote corners of the Philippines or in Africa got these little Japanese-made transistor radios and carry them around. They listen to them long enough, their village life gets transformed. More and more and more. And they hear the news from Moscow and New York and Paris and Tokyo and the United Nations and say, well, why don't we have a representative in the United Nations? And the whole face of the world changes. Africa is changing, Latin America is changing, Asia is changing, partly as a result of the communications revolution brought by radio. And television is doing even more to the United States. See, I don't know how many of you are acquainted with my theories on this matter, but I believe, for example, that television is one of the important influences triggering off the Civil Rights Revolution. Why didn't it happen in the 1930s or 40s? Or why didn't they wait till the 1980s or 90s? Well, I think it happened in the 1960s because those are the years in which the first generation of children completely brought up by television sets arrived at the age of 16, including Negro children. And they started to go downtown and see if they can get a Coke and a hamburger at the dime store, and they got thrown out. But the television set had told them all their lives, you are an American, you are entitled to eat, drink, and wear what other Americans eat, drink, and wear. And they'd received that message every day in front of that television set. And suddenly, the culture says no to them. And so they began to demonstrate. Remember, in the early 1960s, the big demonstrations began with high school and college kids in the South at lunch counters, demanding their ordinary share of consumer goods, hamburgers and a Coke, at a public place of refreshment. This is only one of the beginnings of the many things that television is doing to the culture. What it's doing right now with a fantastically increased ingenuity of television advertising. What it's doing now with television's basic technique, commercial television especially, of translating all human hopes for success in life, hopes for a happy marriage, hopes for friendship, hopes for whatever, hopes for good health, any hopes that you may have whatsoever can be solved by buying something or other that's advertised in a commercial. And if all human aspirations are translated to consumer goods, what's that doing into the culture? And what does one do in rebellion against it? And so on. I think that Marshall McLuhan's ideas may be profoundly mistaken in some respects, but tremendously important in others because he's called attention to the question. Because, as he said, the medium is the message. That's an overstatement of a basically important idea, that depending on the kind of medium through which you get your ideas, you get a certain frame of mind, a certain way of, a certain way your mind operates as a result of the kind of medium through which you habitually get your news about the world. See? Someone once said about Sigmund Freud that if everything he said about the unconscious were proved to be wrong, he would still remain a very great man, because he pointed out that there is such a thing as the unconscious. I've often been tempted to say very much the same kind of thing about Korzybski. That everything Korzybski said about semantics and the linguistic and semantic environment were wrong. He would still be a very great man for calling attention to the unsuspected component in human action and behavior and thought, that is, the linguistic dimension. And similarly, if everything that McLuhan has said about television is wrong, he's still worth reading, because someone's got to study this basic problem: what is television doing to us? And no one's really researching this, you understand, because advertisers' research is very narrow, directed to how much of such and such a product does such and such a commercial sell. It doesn't go much deeper than that, you see. Yes? I'm going to repeat the question as soon as I understand it. I think the question was that if social realities are created by language, is a newer kind of social reality, namely peace, capable of being created by language? I think it's the only way it can be created. But it isn't easy. Have you ever read my little story called Red Eye and the Woman Problem? Have you ever read that? It's in Language and Thought and Action. It's the preface to the first part, Book 1 of the 1964 edition of Language and Thought and Action, called Red Eye and the Woman Problem. I'll read it. Who's got the... Yeah. Once, tens of thousands of years ago, before history began, people were worried, as they had been long since, about the chaotic condition of their lives. For in those days, men took by force the women they desired. There was no way of stopping them. So if you wanted a woman but found she was already the partner of another man, all you needed to do was to kill him and drag her home. Naturally, someone else might slug you a little later to get her away from you, but that was a chance you took if you wanted to have a woman at all. Consequently, there wasn't much of what you would call family life. The men were too busy suspiciously watching each other. And time that might have been spent fishing and hunting and otherwise raising the general standard of living was wasted in constant and anxious measures to defend one's woman. Many people saw that this was no way for human beings to live. As they said among themselves, truly we are strange creatures. In some ways we are highly civilized. We no longer eat raw flesh as did our primitive ancestors. Our technical men have perfected stone arrowheads and powerful bows so that we can slay the fastest deer that runs. Our medicine men can foretell the running of fish in the streams, and our sorcerers drive away illnesses. And at the Institute of Advanced Studies at Princeton, a group of bright young men are said to be working out a dance that will make the rain fall. Little by little, we are mastering the secrets of nature, but so that we're able to live like civilized creatures, not like beasts. Yet, they continued, we have not mastered ourselves. There are those among us who continue to snatch women away from each other by force, so that every man of necessity lives in fear of his neighbors. People agree, of course, that all this killing has got to be stopped, but no one's stopping it. And the most fundamental of human problems, that of securing a mate and bringing up one's own children under some kind of decent, orderly system, remains unsolved. And unless we can find some way of placing the man-woman relationship on a decent and human basis, our pretensions to civilization are hollow. On their future behavior. And this contract was to be known as, quote, marriage, unquote. And the man in the marriage was to be known as husband and the woman as wife. And they further proposed that this contract be honored by all and observed by all members of the tribe. In other words, if a given woman, Slender Shanks, was known to be the, quote, wife of a given man, Beetlebrow, everybody in the tribe was to agree not to molest their domestic arrangements. And furthermore, they proposed that if anyone failed to respect this contract and killed another man to possess his, quote, wife, unquote, he was to be published by the collective force of tribal authority. So in order to put these proposals into effect, a great conference was called and delegates arrived from all branches of the tribe. I wrote a draft of this at the time, gosh, this is a long time ago, of the United Nations meetings in San Francisco. I just wrote it and rewrote it, starting there. Some came with glad hearts, filled with the hope that humanity was about to enter a new era. Some came with faint hearts, not expecting much to come out of the conference, but feeling that it was at least worth a try. Some people came simply because they'd been elected delegates and were getting their expenses paid. All the time the conference was going, however, a big backward savage called Red Eye the Atavism, who was so loudmouthed that he always had a following in spite of his unprepossessing personality, kept shouting scornful remarks from the sidelines. He called the delegates visionaries, eggheads, impractical theorists, starry-eyed dreamers, crackpots, and panty waists. He pointed out that many of the delegates had themselves been at an earlier date women snatchers. This, unfortunately, was true. These are direct quotations from Westbrook Pegler and his comments on the UN meeting. So he shouted to Hairy Hands, who was one of the delegates, "You don't think Brawny Legs is going to leave your woman alone just because he makes an agreement, do you?" And he shouted to Brawny Legs, "You don't think Hairy Hands is going to leave your woman alone just because he makes an agreement, do you?" And he poured derision on all the delegates, referring to their discussion as striped pants kind of talk, like who ever heard of husband, wife, marriage, and all that double-dome Choctaw. That's again a direct quotation. Then Red Eye the Atavism turned to his following, the crowd of timid and tiny-minded people who always found their self-assurance in the loudness of his voice. And he yelled, "Look at those fool delegates, will you? They think they can change human nature." And thereupon the crowd rolled over with laughter and repeated after him, "Ha ha, they think they can change human nature." That broke up the conference. It was another 2,000 years, therefore, before marriage was finally instituted in that tribe. 2,000 years during which innumerable men were killed defending their women. 2,000 years during which men who had no designs on their neighbors' women killed each other as a precaution against being killed themselves. 2,000 years during which the arts of peace languished. 2,000 years during which people despaired as they dreamed of a distant future time when a man might live with a woman of his choice without arming himself with the teeth and watching over her day and night. Perhaps you find this little fiction depressing. Whether you do or not depends on what you abstract from it as the most important feature. Red Eye the Atavism, it is true, scored a victory on that occasion. But it's also true that marriage, however imperfect an institution that may be, was finally established. However, as for instituting the social agreements to prevent international violence in today's world, we don't have 2,000 years to find the solution. Indeed, we don't have 200 years, nor even 20, perhaps not even two. And that's our problem. Forgive me for, quoting from my own deathless prose, but getting agreements made is not easy. It just isn't. Think of the number of labor organizers beaten and even killed, and the company goon squads and so on, that fight back and forth for decades before we have an orderly, labor management relationship, and it isn't any too orderly even yet in some cases. See? And so all of us come to these problems with a burden of past cultural memories and cultural habits, and then we have to reorganize them somehow and make something new out of it. It's never easy. But there's no other way than linguistic agreement, is there? There's no other way than something like a strengthened United Nations in the long run, a strengthened World Federalist, or something of the kind, some kind of, as Tennyson said, a parliament of man. We've got to get there.